Hi everyone, I'm Jonas Nahm. I'm an assistant professor of energy, resources and environment at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And I've written a short memo for this workshop about the pitfalls and opportunities from green industrial policy. The past 2 decades have witnessed this incredible resurgence of industrial policy making, especially in sectors related to decarbonization. And so governments across both developing and advanced economies have used government intervention to essentially achieve kind of economic policy goals that the market alone wouldn't achieve. And we've seen these kinds of green industrial policies occur in Europe and in the European Union, both economies with fairly status policymaking traditions, so perhaps not places that are entirely sort of unsurprising locations for green industrial policy. But we've seen also a resurgence of green industrial policies in places that had much more market-driven sort of approaches to governing the domestic economy, including the United Kingdom and the United States. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, which brings us all together here, and which introduced a range of green industrial policy measures to accelerate the development of green industries in the United States, is only one example. The US, of course, has used other industrial policies in the past to spur the development of domestic clean energy markets, both at the federal and the state level. And so in this policy, I review existing literatures on green industrial policy making and sort of make three central points. The first point that I make is that there's a political logic that drives industrial policy interventions as they relate to the energy transition. And the main point that I make there is that governments attempt to build political coalitions behind climate policy making, and they do so often by promising new sources of economic growth and of employment, especially because the transition to the net zero economy requires vast public resources and investments. And so there's a tendency for governments to overpromise and sort of say and state and promise that green industrial policy will yield full domestic sort of autonomous green industries and in sectors ranging from wind, solar to batteries. And so the promise is essentially that as a result of these policy interventions, we'll see full domestic supply chains that kind of invent these new technologies, that can commercialize them and manufacture them domestically. And the reality in these industries is that we rarely get these domestic industries, but we rather get sort of an integration of the domestic economy with much broader global supply chains. And a key segment of each of these supply chains is located in China today. And so China is sort of responsible for a big chunk of the mass production of components, of products, but also of raw materials in these sectors, even though governments have repeatedly promised to sort of beat China in this clean energy race and to develop these industries domestically. The second broad point that I make in the memo is that although many industrial policy strategies originate in the policy interventions of late economic development in East Asia, particularly the experiences of Japan and South Korea, the challenges of the energy transition go far beyond what we've seen in this sort of late economic development context. And so the social science literature can only be a starting point for us to learn how to tackle these challenges today. And the key difference I see between sort of the green industrial policy challenges today and the economic policy interventions in late development is that in late development, you can essentially benchmark against the leaders in these industries that you're trying to catch up on domestically. But in clean energy industries, we now in some sectors are catching up to, for instance, what China has done before us. But in other sectors, we are already at the technological frontier. And so we can't really benchmark and replicate what others have done, but have to experiment. And so by definition, the kinds of policy tools and interventions that are needed to spearhead sort of the industrial development that can accompany and motivate a green energy transition is much more varied and complex than what we've seen in late economic development. And the third and final kind of point that I make in the memo, that this use of green industrial policies is unlikely to be successful unless we also get to some of the root institutional reasons why these promised domestic supply chains didn't quite develop in the way that policymakers made us believe. And I think a key reason for that are institutional deficiencies that over time have led to a demise of manufacturing in many advanced industrial economies, including in the United States. And so as we set goals, use local content requirements, public subsidies and so on to push the development of clean industries domestically, we also need to invest in the kinds of vocational training, for instance, that would provide a workforce for these firms, a financial sector that would actually lend to manufacturing businesses in the United States. And so some of these proposals have been discussed in the US, including, for instance, in the IFCAS proposal that was debated in 2022 and basically would have established the development of a clean, of a manufacturing bank that was supposed to lend to strategic industrial sectors, including in clean energy industries. But few of these sort of federal institutions have actually been implemented. And so we're now using green industrial policy in many ways without also sort of adjusting the institutional underpinnings of the manufacturing economy. And so that could cause some problems. And so I conclude really by saying that economists have long warned that industrial policies are often prone to capture. They can lead to all sorts of inefficiency and the misallocation of capital. But I see a different set of challenges of green industrial policy that are ultimately maybe less about governments picking the wrong winners than about getting right the kind of domestic and international politics of green industrial policy making. And so, as I outlined in the memo, governments tend to sort of overpromise on these policy outcomes related to decarbonization. They have a tendency to enact policies that are fundamentally in conflict with these existing global supply chains that have made clean energy technologies cheap and accessible. And they often underinvest in the economic institutions that can make industrial policy successful. And so these kinds of challenges create an opening for us as social scientists, I think, to reinvest in research that sort of examines the politics and implementation of industrial policy making. And it helps us, or would help us, if we could find out and sort of examine what kinds of structural problems governments need to fix in order to make good on these economic development goals that they've set for themselves. And in many ways, I think the stakes have never been greater because of these recent sort of industrial policies in this green space. Climate and economic policy goals are now so tightly linked. And so if we fail to meet our economic development goals in this space, we are now also falling short of meeting our climate targets. And so getting the industrial policy part right is more important than ever. Thank you.